Okay, so week 7, the background of slavery a little bit and abolitionism. Now, I'm not really getting into kind of the origins of slavery, the justification, etc. I do want to start out, though, by saying slavery was an economic institution. The reason that slavery was employed was not simply because there were racists in the South, but because slavery was essential to the Southern economy. I think we've touched upon this in the past, but I just kind of want to reiterate that before we get started here. So anti-slavery sentiment. Now this developed during the 1770s, is kind of not its earliest time, but when it becomes really to the fore. Political consciousness begins to rise. Part of this was due to the revolutionary generation of Americans themselves, who propagated the core ideas of the Enlightenment. For example, the worth of the individual, freedom, equality, democracy. Slaves in Massachusetts would actually petition the general court at this time for emancipation. In other areas, less formal actions reflected a growing awareness of bondage and its contrast to the freedom sought by colonists. Now, whites also recognized the irony of a group of colonies seeking freedom while still enslaving a whole population. And one of the interesting things here is that some of our founding fathers who were slaveholders still supported the idea of emancipation. Thomas Jefferson, one of the more noted slaveholders, who had sexual relations with one of his slaves, very well known. He actually did support abolition. And one of the reasons, of course, this has not come through, we've talked about it in the past, the Constitutional Convention, the only way to keep the nation together was to allow for slavery, as despicable as that sounds. It was a pragmatic way to keep the nation going. Again, in retrospect, very immoral, but one has to look at the time. History is about context. So, getting back to Jefferson, note in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson talks about being enslaved by the British tyrant. He calls for universal equality, and this, of course, rings hollow among some. But again, for the founders, this is important. I mean, they recognize why freedom and individual rights are so important. Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense, as well as many other important works, one of our leading founding fathers, arguably one of our most important. He mused in 1775, quote, "How can Americans complain so loudly of attempts to enslave them while they hold so many hundreds of thousands in slavery?" Some slave owners even recognized this hypocrisy. They would echo Paine's sentiments, going so far as to either free their slaves or allow them to purchase their freedom. Now, this happened most in areas with smaller numbers of slaves. We see a little bit in the South and, of course, in the North. An evangelical upsurge also contributed to rising anti-slavery sentiment. And again, we were talking about the 1770s, the end of the 18th century here, before, during, and after the Revolution. These Christians recognized all were equal in God's eyes and also recognized the hypocrisy of slavery, especially, again, in a nation that believed that it was part of a mission from God. Slavery went against their Christian values, and slaves were welcomed into these churches. Now, some parts of the nation actually took measures to foster this liberty. In 1780, for example, Pennsylvania legislated what was called a gradual emancipation. Now, this sounds great in theory, right? But in reality, it was not an immediate end, and there were some loopholes. Only slaves born after the law was enacted were ineligible, and they could not expect to receive their freedom until they had served a 28-year term of indenture. Thus, if you were born in 1780, the slave could not enjoy freedom until at least 1808. Many were held even longer. Now, by controlling slave children under this gradual emancipation, slaveholders could also dominate their parents, sometimes forcing them to sign long-term contracts in order to have visitation with their children. In 1780, when Pennsylvania initiated this legislation, other northern states, for example, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, or the largest northern slave state, New York, these other northern states, the legal liquidation of slavery had not even begun. So this was progress, but not much. But again, remember, here we are in the 1780s, and these New England states that we often consider as key to abolitionism, they had not begun to end slavery. So really, at this point, there are pockets within the nation that are making attempts. We have protests, etc., and we're going to get to those here in a little bit. Now, by 1804, only 24 years later, all northern states but Delaware had committed themselves to a slow end of slavery via similar methods, again, via this gradual emancipation. Now, states were taking legal action to change the institution of slavery, and many believed that slavery would begin to fade out on its own. And again, that's part of the reason for the justification at the Constitutional Convention and shortly thereafter. Slavery was important again for labor intensive agriculture, and the South was becoming a single crop system focusing on cotton. But remember, the time involved in picking the seeds from the compact bolls and short staple cotton rendered its cultivation unprofitable. Even though cotton was seen as a potential savior of the South's economy, this issue rendered it less and less viable. But technology reared its head, and as we discussed, in 1793, Eli Whitney perfected the cotton gin. Now, in the South, slaves were an integral part of society and economy. As Ira Berlin has stated, the South was a slave society. Southerners, for the most part, doubled down as the argument over slavery began to grow. They held tighter control over their slaves, punished them more harshly if they tried to leave, and ignored any claims to calls for the institution's end. Now, that said, some manumission in the Upper South did occur. Free black communities grew in both Maryland and Virginia after the Revolution. Planters debated the practical benefits of slave labor in a supposedly free republic. But of course, not everyone agreed. We know George Washington freed his slaves upon his death. Jefferson, unfortunately, did not. And Patrick Henry, one of the strongest and most charismatic voices for liberty, also held on to his. After the Revolution, anti-slavery sentiment, or abolitionism, began to grow even stronger among whites. By the end of the Revolution, only Georgia and South Carolina continued to allow the importation of slaves. Massachusetts had specifically prohibited it altogether, and we discussed Pennsylvania's well-intentioned but slow attempt. In the mid-1780s, most states had active anti-slavery societies, even in the South. In 1807, Congress voted to permanently outlaw the importation of slaves in the following year, and little debate was raised. Now, so this is key. So we're no longer importing slaves from Africa. Unfortunately, we're still allowing them. Obviously, they're born into slavery. Other than ministers, because we've already kind of touched on Christianity, and it's important in abolitionism, but other than ministers, the abolition movement had many proponents. Now, one of the leading voices would be William Lloyd Garrison, who founded the paper The Liberator in 1831. This was the first prominent anti-slavery newspaper. He founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society in 1832, and a year later he would create the American Anti-Slavery Society. Now, these societies had existed since the mid-1700s, but Garrison's societies were much more radical. Earlier groups had called for a gradual end to slavery and to help raise money so that slaves could purchase their own freedom, manumission. Garrison and his followers, in contrast, called for an absolute and immediate end to slavery with no compensation to slave owners. For these folks, there was to be no compromise. Garrison eschewed politics because he believed it was about compromise, and he did not want any compromise on the issue. The Liberty Party would form in 1840. This was an abolitionist political party. Garrison was loud and vociferous, and, as you can expect, not too popular. For example, he was dragged through the streets of Boston and almost killed. He had a bounty on his head of $4,000 and even called for the North to secede from the Union. So he was what we might call radical, especially for the times. But think about that. Again, he was dragged through the streets of Boston and almost killed. Boston is one of these cities in the Northeast. We often consider it part of this abolitionist legacy. They couldn't have had slaves in Boston. Everything was good up there. No, not the case at all. We see plenty of racism up there. And slaves would sometimes... Well, later on, they would kind of, I don't want to say joke, but they would comment that in the South, they knew that their owner, or even after emancipation, they knew that their neighbors were racist. But they would go to the Northeast or go to the North. People treated them the same, quote unquote, but they still had the same beliefs. So kind of better to know that the person actually has these feelings rather than those people trying to hide it, kind of the thing there. So again, this is Garrison, again, radical, not too popular, but stood forthright and did not back down. Abolitionism was spreading. In 1836, there were so many petitions to end slavery that Congress passed a gag rule automatically tabling any discussion of abolition. King Andrew also forbade postal carriers from delivering abolitionist literature in the South. He, the man of the people, right? There were other important leaders of abolition. Women, again, played a key role in this movement, and their experience here would help to forge the early women's movement, much like the civil rights movement would spur feminism over a century later. Take part 2 of the class, we'll get to that. Included in this group of female abolitionists were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Grimke sisters, which we'll touch upon again a little bit later. And of course, slaves did not simply sit meekly by. As the revolutionary generations came of age, dissent grew. More slaves simply ran away to try and find freedom. This would lead to the fugitive slave law, which we will discuss in full when we talk about the run up to the Civil War. Other slaves worked slower in an attempt to make the work less efficient, sometimes breaking tools or quote unquote losing them so they did not have to use them. Some actually talked back and some would become violent. Many slaves were simply not passive, but active in their efforts to gain liberation. They ran away in droves, following the Underground Railroad to freedom in Canada or northern states. They fled to Indian communities and joined them in wars. Some would even poison their masters. So African Americans were not bystanders. Free blacks worked toward abolition as well, and some slaves would create whatever havoc that may work toward their freedom. A few major slave revolts in the 19th century offer some examples of this pushback, though there were countless such insurrections dating back to the 17th century. Let's start with Gabriel's Rebellion of 1800. This upset a somewhat delicate balance that had been achieved in Virginia after the 1782 Act that authorized owners to free their slaves. Some skilled workers were able to hire themselves out. They educated themselves. One man heard about the Haitian Revolution and wanted more instantaneous change. He and his fellow rebels would lead a revolt in Richmond and expected about 1,000 slaves to follow them in an attack on the city, which targeted Federalists and merchants. Notably, Gabriel expected, quote, the poor white people, as well as, quote, the most redoubtable Republicans, to join his cause to foster change. Those involved in the revolt, and this is really early, this is before the Republican Party that we know of that started with Lincoln, that was specifically an abolitionist party. But again, we have some Republicans who view slavery as wrong. So again, he expects poor whites and Republicans to come aboard. Those involved in the revolt marched under a banner which stated "Death or Liberty." The assault was planned for August 30th, 1800, but it never came together. A torrential rain hit, which caused confusion and disorganization, and one from which within the ranks would inform the authorities about what was going to happen. There's always somebody who spills the information, right? The state would end up executing 27 of the rebels by public hanging. In the big picture, though, it also led to a tightening of restrictions on slaves. Even though there were earlier efforts to modify the institution and allow for more freedoms, one result of the rebellion was to decrease some of these freedoms. Many believed that making the system more humane had only encouraged resistance. Specific changes included literacy was forbidden, and being hired out to work for others was rendered illegal. The Virginia legislature also attempted to prevent enslaved people from piloting their own boats, which would, of course, allow for free travel. Now, in 1822, Denmark Vesey was a slave who had bought his freedom actually in 1799. He became a carpenter in Charleston, South Carolina, but his existence was disrupted by the growing sectional conflict, by growing passions for and against slavery. Similar to the civil rights movement over a century later, the more advances that were made, the more those who supported slavery dug in and acted in their own behalf to retain the institutions they believed essential. Now, for every action, there is a reaction. And you don't need to be a science major to know that. White authorities and pro-slavery elements would harass him and the black community over the next 2 decades, even closing down the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1820 that Vesey had helped to build. But more important, this was the center of the community, where people came together, worshipped, commingled, talked, etc. July 1822, partially due to this harassment and partially due to Northern attacks on slavery, Vesey would organize a rebellion designed to seize the city of Charleston. But the plot was reported to authorities and quashed. 131 free and enslaved blacks were arrested, 72 were found guilty, 35 of these were executed. The reaction, again, greater restrictions on slaves. Proponents of slavery dug in to protect their way of life and the institution they felt integral to their economic livelihood. Now, again, I didn't get into really what we see as some of the loosening of the restraints on slavery prior to this time, but there were some actions taken. I've discussed a few, but there is a lot more in depth if you research. Many of these states were making changes and allowing more freedoms for individual slaves. But again, with these rebellions, many felt that the freedoms that were provided actually led to them. Thus, again, the tightening of the belts. Now, the most famous of all slave rebellions was probably that of Nat Turner in 1831. Turner was somewhat of a mystic and was said to have had religious visions up to and including speaking with God. In 1831, Turner claimed one of these visions had spurred him to initiate a slave revolt, and he would organize approximately 70 slaves who went from plantation to plantation, where they would murder men, women, and children, ultimately killing about 75. They gathered more supporters as their rampage continued, but eventually they ran out of ammunition and they were captured. Turner and 18 of his colleagues were hanged. Now, overall, what is the result of these conspiracies? Again, we have increased protection, further restrictions on slavery. Tighter control became the norm, even though prior to Gabriel, many states had actually eased up on slaves and their practices. After Turner's actions, those in the South increased what were called slave patrols and tightened slave codes. Thus, combined with the introduction of the cotton gin, these efforts at rebellion only served to strengthen the institution of slavery and further divide the pro and anti-slavery elements in the nation. Now, again, we are going to discuss that more when we get to the run-up in the Civil War. I usually take a couple weeks in class when I lecture about the run-up to the Civil War because those foundations are so essential to not just the fighting of the Civil War, but what would happen afterward. Now, I wanted to mention again, just kind of reiterate, Christianity was key. Christianity helped support many of these anti-slavery societies. And again, to reiterate some of the more important abolitionists, of course, Garrison, who I had mentioned earlier, Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, Sarah and Angelina Grimke. These are, again, were just a few, as well as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who I had mentioned. William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator was the first, again, the most and one of the most important abolitionist newspapers. Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe, brought attention to the treatment of African American slaves. Her work sold well throughout the world, literally. And much like what we see with the civil rights movement in the 1960s, for example, the Birmingham campaign, when publicity is brought to an issue, it provides more breadth for those who are protesting. It provides more support. And in this case, what Harriet Beecher Stowe did was she wrote a book, again, detailing how awful slaves were treated. Many people didn't know this. If you lived in the North and you didn't have a slave and you never saw slavery, you wouldn't know how slaves were treated. Similarly, and again, in other parts of the country, this really opened the eyes of many people, brought attention. And going back to the Grimke sisters, and I had mentioned Elizabeth Cady Stanton, when they held their efforts in 1848, it was based upon their own experiences at the anti-slavery conference in London. They were denied entry to the floor simply because they were women. So when they came back to the United States, they organized that, and we'll get to that later on, but that was really kind of, Seneca Falls Conference was really kind of the first step toward women's equality, suffrage, etc. So again, we have this connection between the women's movement and abolitionism in the 19th century. We'll see that again with the civil rights movement. Now, one question to ask yourself, why might some workers be against abolition? Because some workers were against abolition in the North and the South. Well, for the same reason that we sometimes see anti-immigration beliefs. They feared that they were going to lose their jobs. They feared that competing with this labor may cause their wages to decrease, because again, if somebody's coming out of slavery, they're going to work for cheaper than the person who has already been working at a place for 20, 30 years. Thus, for them, slavery helped to solidify their job security. This is also a view of historian Edmund Morgan from his work, Slavery and Freedom, the American Paradox. Very briefly, without getting into the details, his belief was that the expansion of slavery limited the number of reckless freedmen without property, thus making it more possible for these new freedmen to acquire property and possibly even a slave. Slavery allowed this poorer class a new modicum of status, thereby satiating them in some ways. Basically, what he's saying is that by making slaves the lowest level in society, poor whites who had very few rights anyway, well, I shouldn't say very few rights, but very few opportunities and limited rights in some ways, because they were above slaves, they did have some status. And so slavery helped to bolster them and minimize any type of reaction or revolution. And this is key because what we'll see later, if African Americans and poor whites work together, if they make it a class issue rather than just a race issue, authority is going to be in trouble. So something, again, to kind of consider. So again, to reiterate, the fear from these uprisings led to tightening down on slavery. And one other notable thing that also contributed this was the concern among white men, especially in the South, that slaves would rape their women, wives, daughters, etc. And this will really be exacerbated during the Civil War. Northern papers especially would bring this up if they were seeking peace or they were seeking for the Union to end their experiment. And this is really where, well, we'll get to that down the road. But again, this is a major fear, and this is a fear that is played upon by journalists often. So, a few statistics. I mentioned I wanted to claim some statistics. 10.5 million slaves survived the Middle Passage to the New World. Of these, approximately 388,000 were shipped directly to North America. This is from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database online. So think about that. 10.5 million slaves came to the New World from Africa. Of these, 388,000 were directly shipped to North America. Where are all those other slaves going? Well, they're going to the Caribbean. They're going to South America. Most African slaves were shipped directly to the Caribbean, to South America. Brazil, for example, received 4.86 million Africans alone. Now, how many people owned slaves? As I told you, the majority of people did not. Approximately 1/3 of Southern families had slaves. In Mississippi and South Carolina, the number approached about a half. There were 385,000 slave owners in the South, and this includes the African Americans who also held slaves. That's important to remember. Of these 385,000 slave owners in the South, 88% held fewer than 20, and roughly 50% had fewer than 5 slaves. So this mass chattel slavery that we look at was practiced by a small number. Again, roughly 12% of slave owners had more than 20 slaves. So this, of course, does not mitigate the immorality of the practice. This does not say, oh, well, there weren't that many, so it's not that bad. Of course, it was awful. But it is important to remember, because we often think about the South, oh, they all own slaves, they're all racist. Not necessarily the case. So, all right, well, that is the end of my diatribe here, or monologue, I should say, on abolitionism. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, enjoy your week.